to talk about the French Revolution. And what makes this especially significant is that not only is this independence from a monarchy-controlled empire, like in the American independence, this is an actual overthrowing of a monarchy that controls a major world power. So this is on some levels, depending on how you view it, the American Revolution came first and kind of put out the principles of self-governance and why do we need kings and all of that. But the French Revolution was the first time those type of principles really took foot in Europe and really overthrew a monarchy. So just to understand kind of the environment in which this began, let's talk about what France was like in 1789, which most people kind of view as the beginning of the revolution. One, France was poor. France was poor. Now, you wouldn't think that France was poor if you looked at Louis XVI, who was King of France. If you looked at Louis XVI and the clothes he wore, if you looked at Marie Antoinette, his wife, Antoinette, they don't look poor. They lived in the Palace of Versailles, which was ginormous. It's this massive palace, and it would compare to the greatest palaces in the world. They were living a lavish lifestyle. And in case you want to know where this is what's now almost a suburb of Paris, but at the time it was a village 20 or 30 kilometers away from Paris. So they don't seem to be poor, but the actual government of France is poor. And when I say poor, they're in debt. They've just had two major military adventures. One was the American Revolution. American Revolution. They played a major part in supporting the revolutionaries because they wanted to stick it to their enemy, Great Britain. They wanted their empire to be to shrink a little bit. So France sent significant military help and resources, and you can imagine that's not a cheap thing when you're doing it across the Atlantic Ocean. And even before the American Revolution, the 7 Years' War, that ended in 1763, this really drained the amount of wealth that the French government had. And for those of y'all who are more American history focused, the 7 Years' War is really the same thing as the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War was the North American theater of the 7 Years' War, but the 7 Years' War is a more general term because there was also a conflict going on in Europe simultaneously. The French and Indian was just part of that conflict, and the 7 years actually engulfed most of the powers of Europe at the time. So France had participated in this, ended in 1763, and the American Revolution. Both of these really just drained the amount of funds that the government itself had. At the same time, the French people were starving. So people starving. There was a generalized famine at the time. They weren't producing enough grain. People couldn't get their bread to eat. So you can imagine when people are starving, they're not happy. And to make kind of add insult to injury, you would see your royals living like this. But even worse than the royals, who you don't see every day, you saw your nobility, who was roughly a little over, they're about 1.5% of the population. But you saw the nobility really, really living it up. So nobility living it up. Living it up. And the nobility, just so you know, these are people with fancy titles who inherit land and wealth from generation to generation. They don't dress too differently from the king, and they essentially live in smaller versions of the Palace of Versailles. And you work, if you're a peasant, you work on their fields, do all the work, you send them some of your crops, and they pay no taxes. So, from your point of view, and it's not hard to understand why you would think this, these are essentially, kind of parasites who are completely ignoring the fact that you're starving and you're paying all of the taxes. You can imagine people weren't too happy about that. And then to top it all off, you had all of these philosophers hanging around, talking about the Enlightenment. And this is kind of the whole movement where people and authors and poets are starting to realize that, and philosophers are starting to realize that, maybe we don't need kings. Maybe we don't need priests to tell us what it means to be good or bad. Maybe people could essentially could rule themselves all of a sudden. And obviously the biggest proof of the Enlightenment was the American Revolution. That was kind of the first example of people rising up and saying, gee, we don't need these kings anymore. We want to govern ourselves, for the people, by the people. So you also have kind of this philosophical movement going around. Now, if you ask me my opinion of what the biggest thing, I think the people starving, you can never underestimate what people are willing to do when they're actually hungry. And this is kind of more from the intellectual point of view. People said, oh, there's this enlightenment. So this is the state of France. They had a financial crisis. So a meeting was called, kind of an emergency meeting of the major groups of France to try to resolve some of these problems. France it's a fiscal crisis. People are starving. What do you do? So they called the Convocation of the Estates General. Write that down. Convocation of the Estates General, which was a meeting of the three estates of France. Now that sounds like a very, what are the three estates of France? You can really just view them as the three major social classes of France. The first estate was the clergy. The second estate is, let me just write 2 there. The second estate is the nobility. And then the third estate is everyone else. I'm doing a different color. Everyone else. And this gives you a sense of how skewed the power structure, because people kind of grouped the power as, okay, these are the 3 groups and maybe they can vote against each other, but this was only 0.5% of the population. This is 1.5% of the population. This was 98% of the population. 98% of the population, but these people had equal weight with these guys, but these people had the burden of most of the taxes. These are people who are doing all of the work, producing all of France's wealth, dying in the wars, but these guys, despite their small population, have more weight than everybody else. So you had the Convocation of the States Generals, where representatives of these 3 estates met at the Palace of Versailles to essentially figure out what to do about this fiscal crisis. Now, obviously, these people right here, the third estate, they were angry. They're like, look, we've taken the burden on ourselves for much of the recent history of France. But we're tired of you guys getting away with not paying taxes and just kind of leeching off of us. They were afraid that even more of the tax burden is going to be put on them. If nothing is, and the nobility or the king or the clergy, that they wouldn't have to make sacrifices. So they came in already angry. And so they really wanted to meet in one big room together, because they actually had roughly 600 representatives, which only the king in the last minute agreed to. Before, it was only going to be equal numbers of them. These guys had 300, roughly. These guys had 300 as well. These guys were able to say, hey, we're at 98% of the population. Maybe we should have at least 600 representatives. But even there, they wanted to meet in the same room and essentially try to make it so it's one representative, one vote. But obviously these other estates, the clergy and the nobility, say, no, let's each vote as estates and all of that. But at the end of the day, these guys lost. So they were essentially forced to organize independently as the third estate. So that made them even angrier. So they met at an assembly hall and said, you know what? If these guys are going to ignore us, not only are we going to